All right, Felicity, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. In Spanish. Okay. I'm going to connect my headset, so.
Bueno, bienvenidas, y esta es una presentación. Bienvenidos a la reunión de la Fundación Comunitaria de Tahoe, Truckee. Les pedimos por favor completar el formulario demográfico de CCTT, la evaluación de la reunión al final. Esta presentación, para presentarse cada uno, por favor escriba su nombre en el chat, su título y la organización a la cual representa, organización.
And welcome to the Community Collaborative Resource Sharing Meeting. Please complete the collaborative demographic and evaluation form that's in the chat box. If you could do the demographic form before the meeting and the evaluation form after the meeting, that would be helpful. And for introductions, please put your name, title, organization in the chat box. And Sally, I'll go first on the next slide. But just a reminder, the Community Collaborative is a program of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation and is comprised of 46 family strengthening health, education, and social service agencies and nonprofit organizations who work together to address the fundamental needs of children, families, and all residents in the Tahoe Truckee region. And this is our monthly all-partner meeting, which we call a resource sharing meeting.
Fortalecimiento de la comunidad y las familias a través de la colaboración. La Fundación Comunitaria de Tahoe Truckee está conformada por 46 agencias con el objetivo común de apoyar las familias en salud, la educación y a las agencias de servicios sociales y organizaciones sin fines de lucro que trabajan juntos para atender las necesidades de los niños, las familias y los residentes de la región de Tahoe Truckee.
So Felly, do you just want to go ahead and read this slide, please?
So, para obtener la interpretación de esta junta, tienen que presionar abajo a la derecha, en donde hay un redondelito que dice Interpretation, y ahí presionan y pueden obtener la interpretación al español.
Thank you. And so at this point, Christina, I believe Valentina is going to start interpreting. Great. And so again, in the vein of transparent facilitation and learning how to build this muscle as a collaborative, Valentina, I will just look to you to see when you're done talking to change slides. And then Christina, please interrupt at any time. So, as you all know, we have been providing simultaneous interpretation at our last few resource sharing meetings. We talked to several of our partners a couple weeks ago to get some feedback around how it's going. And we have some really, we learned some really helpful takeaways and kind of insights that we wanted to share with you all today. And so this information, if you could keep it in mind when you're either presenting or if you're sharing during resource sharing time, and again, in our overall efforts to ensure that we are providing our resource sharing meetings in English and in Spanish. So we need to allow for a little more time on the agenda in general between slides. So just slow down the pace a little bit, which is difficult for me. We need to pause a little bit more between sentences or complete thoughts. We have to wait for the slide to change. So ensure that we are presenting in English and then in Spanish on this slide before we go to the next slide or vice versa. And just a reminder that in the main broadcast channel, which I am right now, we can hear everybody, whether you're in the English channel or the Spanish channel, except for the interpreter, who today is Valentina, and Valentina jumped in at the last minute, so thank you, Valentina. We need to repeat the questions. So if anybody has a question in the audience, whoever is facilitating or presenting, we just need to ensure that we repeat the question so there is enough time to interpret the question. We're really working towards having small groups where there are Spanish speakers as well as English speakers. And so we will need interpreters for each of our small groups. We're not quite there today, but that is our overall goal. And then we're really encouraging folks to join the channel of your language preference. So you have the choice to join the main channel, which is in English, or the Spanish channel, which Valentina is interpreting for. So those are kind of our key takeaways. And we really appreciate all the folks on this call who have helped us with this process. Like I said, it's new for us, and we are really embracing transparent presentations and facilitation to make sure that we're doing it as best as we can. So a reminder, our meeting guidelines that we've adopted from the Annie E. Casey Foundation that we're using for now. So please bring your best self, be an active listener, be kind and generous, stay engaged, be open and suspend judgment, speak your truth, lean into discomfort, enable empathy and compassion, and expect and accept that there may not be closure. And again, we adopted these meeting guidelines from the Annie E. Casey Foundation to really help support our capacity to have conversations around race and equity. And we've committed to adopting them for all of our meetings for now. So thank you. And again, just a reminder, please put your name, your organization, and who you are in the chat box so we all know who is on the call. So what we are going to do for the next probably 12 minutes or so, we are just going to break out into small groups. So Christina is in the process of putting us into small groups. And just by way of a little get to know you activity, please either share an object that's around you, that's within your reach, that brings you joy, or you can share what is one thing or what are the things that bring you joy at your work or that make you happy at work. So either find an object around you in your working space that brings you joy or whatever space you're in, or share one thing at your work that makes you happy or brings you joy. So the focus on the get to know you during the small groups is on joy. So Christina is going to go ahead and put us into small groups. And Felicity, I see you have a raised hand.
Listen, so I'm Maria Martin from Tahoe Forest Health System, and I'm going to share an update on this planning grant we received from the state of California. The grant just finished at the end of September. And as you can see from the time frame, it was a pretty short turnaround grant. It was actually originally supposed to end in July, but they extended it. So we applied for this grant with all of the partners listed below to give us the opportunity to plan how we might implement ACEs screening in the health system and in our community, and also how we would expand our trauma-informed care in our various organizations. It gave us the opportunity to kind of look at what's going on in our organizations, but then then allow us to think about building a trauma-informed network of care for the Truckee Tahoe community.
Maria, can I, I'm so sorry to interrupt for a second. Valentina is asking us to slow down.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Slow it down. Okay, we can go on to the next page.
I'm just going to let Valentina catch up, Maria, and then I will move the slide.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over like what we've accomplished. We had 6 goals as part of this planning grant, and I'm going to kind of go over where we are in the 6 goals. Some goals were targeted to the health system and others more to the community. Some goals we finished at the end of the grant, but I just want to let you know that we are going to be continuing working on this process of a trauma-informed network of care even past the grant period. Okay, so one of our goals was really about increasing the understanding of the science of toxic stress and its impact on health. And we had a targeted goal to increase awareness in our community through training and education. And so one of the things that we did was we hosted a training through the collaborative hosted a training on in July with Ingrid Cochran on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and race. And that was very well received, and it's an option that we can continue to work on that training long term in different areas. A second goal of the grant will help us plan for kind of our next steps in terms of education and training after this grant period. So we developed a survey that's targeted to healthcare providers, teachers, community-based organizations, and just general community members on their what is their knowledge and awareness about ACEs. And this is a survey that Allison hinted upon that you're going to have the opportunity to complete today. Okay, the third thing had to do with the referral process and referring. One thing that we undertook in this is we tried to look at how could we streamline the referral processes for people, and this was around behavioral health services. So we looked at within our partner organizations, and we tried to streamline the referral processes between the health system, the school district, and the county behavioral health services. Part of this included coming up with a single release of information form that we could use, and really more transparency on the indicators for the types of referrals for different resources, so that when someone made a referral to behavioral health at the county, they would know that it is an appropriate referral, and it would kind of improve that process, and so people know what to expect. And we did this with these small groups in order to like figure out what things might work in kind of a bigger sphere as well. Okay, the fourth goal has to do with getting our medical providers kind of educated and interested in and kind of excited about the process of learning about adverse childhood experiences, trauma-informed care, and toxic stress. So we had a goal of educating 12 providers in the ACEs Aware provider training. This is a 2-hour online training that really goes over like what are ACEs and toxic stress and how would you do a screening. And we were really happy with the response we received. We had 21 providers in the health system, doctors, physician's assistants, nurse practitioners that were trained. They represent providers in various areas, pediatrics, primary care, and OBGYN. So I think that really creates a lot of awareness throughout the health system about this really important topic. And it also will support us in the future as we expand ACEs screening beyond our pilot that we have planned. Okay, and then the specific clinical screening goal that we had is that we're targeting for the grant the pediatric population, and our goal is to increase our screening at well child visits in our PEDS clinic by 25% by the end of 2025. So it's down the road. We chose to pilot the screening in pediatrics as a place to start within the health system. And there's 3 main reasons around it. One is it's an opportunity for prevention to address situations before it gets to the point in children where the adverse experiences and the buildup of toxic stress are really having a detrimental impact on health. The second reason was because we had some provider champions that were really willing to take on this new challenge and work with us. And in our pediatrics department, we have just recently expanded with a lot of follow-up support. So within pediatrics, they have a behavioral health intensivist, which is a licensed clinical social worker that works in that department. They have the support of a pediatric care coordinator, which is a registered nurse, as well as the pediatric behavioral health navigator, who's been kind of working in that arena with the school district and with pediatrics for about the past 6 years. So we had the support there to address any follow-up needs of individuals that they might identify that are at high risk of, have a lot of adverse childhood experiences or at risk of. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the screening process, that it not only involved, getting providers on board, but it also involved setting up the tools in the electronic health records so that they can actually do the screen and chart on it, and developing the clinical workflows for screening and follow-up. And the sixth goal of the grant had to do with a bi-directional referral platform. The time frame for the grant was pretty short, and so we chose to work on a plan to assess the feasibility of implementing a bi-directional referral platform. This was a real big focus of the ACEs Aware initiative, is to have these platforms that are kind of community resources where people can refer, or people can, organizations can refer in the platform, refer a client to services, be able to track whether or not they receive the services, and clients can self-refer. So we did vet several large platforms such as Aunt Bertha and Activate Care and Unite Us, as well as a more local platform through Connecting Point 211. And I think, we think that this type of platform could really benefit all of us, all of the people working in our community, in terms of, improving the referral process and be able to track, connection to resources. And this is something that we will continue to work on in the coming months and as we move forward.
Maria, you have about 1 more minute.
Okay. That takes care of the 6 goals, and we think that lays us a really good groundwork for moving forward. And then I'm just going to pass it on to Lizzie to talk about what the clinical pilot that we're going to be starting next month.
All right, so 1 minute for this, Allison.
Yeah, just a couple.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So we had a clinical work group with pretty much any facet of the pediatrics clinic involved to make sure that we were developing a workflow that would work for the front office, for the medical assistants, for the physicians. Both of the medical providers included our pediatricians, and the follow-up care side. So the resources that Maria was just mentioning with the pediatric behavioral health intensivist, the youth behavior health navigator, and the pediatric care coordinator who's a nurse. We're all involved in this, and we spent many months working on these workflows, and our pilot's going to launch. The plan is November 1st. We chose to screen 3-year well child visits and 6-year well child visits. So if there is a 3 or 6-year well child visit with Dr. Wicks or with Dr. Arth, and we are in the process of recruiting another provider to replace Dr. Arth when he retires. But basically the medical assistant will introduce the PEARLS screener. It's called PEARLS for pediatrics. It stands for Pediatric ACEs and Related Life Events Screener. And The caregiver would have an opportunity to complete this screening. The part 1 is 10 questions and part 2 is 7 questions. And based on not only the score, but if there's any health conditions that the child is experiencing, what, I'll just come stress busters because that's what's on the wheel, but what buffering factors do they have going on in their life as well? So it's not just the screening score, it's really like a triangle. What's their ACE score? What are these buffering factors they have in their life? And are there any health conditions present? So asthma, obesity, you can kind of think of any health condition really. There's the potential for that stress to be impacting that health condition. The medical provider would provide education and counseling regardless of the score. Every caregiver can benefit from having this education. And they'll focus on these 7 elements right here. This wheel is from ACEs Aware, and they can use it as a guide to develop a really simple goal with the family to work on. Can be as simple as being intentional about sitting down to eat a family meal. Yes.
There's a note in the chat just said, please slow down to allow interpretation.
Okay, well, I think that's the end. I only had a minute.
Okay, thank you, Maria and Lizzie, for the quick high-level overview of the planning grant. And I think it's exciting because we have been talking about how to bring trauma-informed work specifically around ACEs to our collaborative for years. So thank you for your work in it. And again, the high-level overview. So Kim Bradley, I believe you're going to talk about implementation at the school district, and then you can turn it over to River.
Hi, so I'm Kim Bradley with Truckee Unified School District Wellness Program. And we were able to use the ACEs grant to offer a district-wide training to all our staff. Just trying to pause. We were really excited to bring Heather Forbes. She is a nationally recognized speaker with Beyond Consequences. She's written 2 books. One is Help for Billy, 80. And what they are a framework for understanding how kids come into the classroom with a lot of trauma, and some of their behavioral issues we see aren't necessarily that they don't want to be in school, but that they are not regulated, and that we need to help them regulate their bodies so that they can be in school and we can support them. So the training was for all our school district staff, which was amazing. Like our bus drivers, our food service, our front office, our custodians, our student teachers, everyone that was part of our T2S team got to participate. It was virtual, and we were able to tailor it to each school site depending on where they were at with learning ACEs and how to support students. And then the best part is that we have access to a year-long online academy where we can access trainings, videos that can be used throughout the school year during our staff meetings. So the training can go on all year. And we really feel like this was the first step in becoming more of a trauma-informed school. And we really appreciated being part of this partnership. We've learned a lot, and I feel like we're on a track where we're able to do more. So yeah, that's the nutshell of it. I'll pass it on to River.
So we are going to be taking a survey today, and we're going to put the survey links. I think Christina, if you actually, yeah, you got them in the chat box. The survey will be in English or Spanish, and it takes maybe about 6 minutes. Before you start the survey, I need you to promise to take the survey. And if you promise to take the survey, we're going to have you type your name into the chat box. So if you go ahead and say, I promise, I'm taking it, just type your name right now into the chat box. So I'm actually should start seeing people's names pop up. And that's how we're gonna decide. We're gonna do a raffle for the gift cards. So please do that. The survey asks you where you work, what type of work you do, whether you're working with schools, if you're working with medical offices, or you're a therapist, a behavioral health therapist, or if you work for an agency like Sierra Community House. If you are representing a church, a faith-based community, or maybe law enforcement, go ahead and choose community-based agency because there's not another category. I hope all of you are working for an agency in Tahoe, Truckee. If you don't work in Tahoe, Truckee, and you don't serve people in Tahoe, Truckee, we don't need you to do this survey, but most of you do. So I expect hopefully all 53 people on this call today will take the survey. So the questions ask you about how much you know about ACEs and toxic stress. And it also asks about your work. You know, if you feel like your workplace knows about it, if you have policies or procedures at your workplace to deal with people with trauma, or to help people with trauma, sorry. It also asks about training that you think that you need, and what our community needs to understand. So you're kind of representing your agency, kind of grading your agency, or talking about what you might need at your agency as well. So I think, I don't want to say too much. I think we're going to go ahead and let people take the survey. So is that what we're doing now, Christina? We're going to go ahead and let people.
Yeah, I mean, we're running a little behind on time, so I'll let Allison jump in on that. But yes, please start taking this.
Yep. I think we have, yeah, like maybe 5 minutes or so for some survey taking time, or some quiet time if you've already taken it. And we'll reconvene at like 10:50. Does that sound good?
Yeah, so please go ahead and click the link, the English or Spanish link in the chat box. That will take you to the survey. And then if you've already taken it, just use this as a little potty break. Thank you.
I've committed to completing the survey. And so 3 of you will receive a $10 gift card to Starbucks for your commitment. So I'm going to press the center to see if it works. Erica Martin, the Katana Truckee, congratulations. Very exciting. Oh, yes, okay. Number 2. Paula Lauer, thank you, Paula. So Paula is a therapist with your mental wellness group. So thank you, Paula. And our 3rd and final winner for completing the survey is, oh, so close, Peter Mayfield, who is the founder and executive director of Gateway Mountain Center. So congratulations to our winners. Congratulations, Peter. I appreciate your excitement. And thank you, River and ACES team, for all your good work. And please help share the survey, I believe, River, with colleagues and friends.
And
colleagues,
if you didn't, yeah,
colleagues.
If you didn't take it, go ahead and just click it and save the link. Maybe take it later. And I guess Christina can send out the links in English or Spanish.
Thank you. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time for resource sharing. And again, I appreciate everybody's patience with us as we learn to use the new technology and the pacing of our meetings. Christina and I have talked quite a bit how we are definitely like a learning collaborative, and this is a significant learning for us. So thank you. So we have a few minutes to hear from partners, any updates or programmatic highlights that you have going on. So please either raise your virtual hand and I will call on you, or you can put your name in the chat box that you have an announcement. And if we don't get to you, which I imagine we won't be able to get to everybody, we do have a bulletin coming out next week. And then also we do have our Slack channel, which we really encourage people to utilize. So Paula, I see your hand up. Would you please share your screen again? And I did add that one additional slide. So we are now in just a moment going to welcome Herman Fillmore to our collaborative meeting. So Herman, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And before we turn it over to Herman, I just want to remind everybody on kind of how we got here. And so last year, our collaborative committed to participating in what we are calling at this point a learning journey. And it's really a series of learnings and education that are focused specifically on bringing anti-racist, again, learnings and resources to our collaborative. So there's kind of 7 different parts of our learning journey. The first part, which we have spent some time on, is around different frameworks. And I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly. We're not going to spend a lot of time just because we only have a little less than an hour. So we talked about some frameworks. We practiced facilitating and holding conversations around race. And we definitely heard from you all that we would like to spend, or you all would like to spend more time on that. So we've started talking about other trainings that we could bring to our collaborative. And we're actually on the 3rd part of our learning journey, which is really around the history of racism in the Tahoe Truckee area, the history of racism across the country, and the background on the origin of the concepts of race, racism in our laws and policies. So we have a race and equity committee that we have been meeting with. Many of you are on the call, so thank you so much for your help and support. And we thought it would be most helpful for this part of the learning journey to really hear a local voice and a local perspective. And so with that in mind, I'd like to welcome Herman Fillmore to our collaborative. Herman is the Culture Language Resources Director for the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California and has been since 2017. He currently sits on the Dresslerville Community Council and Washoe Tribal Council and graduated from the University of New Mexico in 2012 with a BA in Native American Studies and a minor in linguistics. And Herman, I really appreciate all the work that you put into presenting to our collaborative today. I know you were supposed to come last month, and then we asked you to come this month instead because we were kind of in emergency response mode as a community around some of the Caldor fire evacuations and the power shutoff. So we appreciate your flexibility, and we are really grateful that you have the rest of the meeting to spend with us. So I will turn it over to you.
Hello, can you hear me all right? Okay,
Yes, we can.
I'm kind of working on 2 screens, so I have my phone up with the video and everything. So if there's any issue hearing me, just let me know and I can either speak up or repeat what I had said. So I'm calling this presentation the Wa-siw in recognition of the Washoe people. And we're going to go over a brief history of the people from here. That's what Wa-siw means in our language, is the people from here. So first of all, miwanga wa bibi, Washoe at Lu Haliza digam dia lei, debo at Lu Herman Fillmore digam dia lei. Di lot Laura Fillmore degam dia kei, ashtigo at Benny Fillmore degam dia kei, then Laya Maria Luisa, ida dingam del Palelik degam dia kei, di ama verdita snooks. Bow de dei lei, ashbawa lukum danu shilu lei. So in Washoe, my name is Haliza. In English, I'm known as Herman Fillmore. My mother is Laura. My father is Benny. My fiance is Maria Luisa, and our son is Del Pilelik, which means lightning in our language. My paternal grandmother, and this is on my Washoe side, is Bernita Snooks. I live in what is today known as the Carson Valley, or in Washoe Bow, and I'm of the Bow people, or the people of the Carson Valley. So I'm going to get started on this presentation. I'm going to go over quite a few topics in the beginning that aren't directly related to Washoe people, but I think it's important for everybody to understand kind of in the greater scheme of things, the issues that Indigenous peoples face, and really just some of the parts of Indigenous communities that aren't talked about quite so often.
Herman, before you get to, I'm sorry for interrupting. Christina, I just want to make sure we're good on our technology. We're good. Okay.
No, I don't know. I appreciate that. I was just trying to
Okay.
pull up the Spanish to put in the chat box. But Valentina, if you could help interpret that people need to join the Spanish slides again by clicking on ver diapositivas, then they'll be able to see the Spanish.
I think Valentina has a question.
Sorry, I was sharing my screen. I'm not able to jump over to the Spanish
Okay.
to hear her. Are you able to jump
Yeah.
over? Okay.
Hi. Yes, I can hear you. I'm in the Spanish channel right now. Okay. And you were able to hear Herman before? Excellent. Cool. Okay. Thank you, Herman. It's all you.
No problem at all. So the first slide that I have is terminology. And so I'm going to go over just some terminology that's used in Indigenous communities, which may not be common knowledge to everybody. Some of these are buzzwords today. Some of them are more specific to tribal issues. So first, throughout this presentation, I will use the term Washoe and Wa-siw in place of Washoe or Washoe, which is the O, when referring to Indigenous people, land, and language. Although the tribe is recognized as the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California, every tribe has a unique name for itself that may be different than what they are recognized as federally. So in our language, instead of saying Washoe, we refer to ourselves as Wa-siw. And it's the kind of most correct and least anglicized version of our name for ourselves. When talking about Indigenous people, you'll hear me use this term in place of American Indians or Native Americans. Again, the big reason being that Indigenous peoples today understand ourselves as predating the discovery or acknowledgement of America. So being Native American or American Indian isn't really reflective of who we were prior to the United States being here. So a lot of times in academia today, you'll hear the word Indigenous, or you'll also hear the term Aboriginal peoples. It's used a lot more in Canada, but also in Australia as well. I will talk about tribes and tribal nations. When I use these terms, I'm talking about federally or state recognized groups of Indigenous peoples with unique ties to their homelands, distinct languages or cultures, and histories of self-governance that existed prior to the arrival of settlers. I may use the term pan-indigeneity. This refers to aspects of Indigenous people's cultures and cultural norms that are shared. An example here is powwows. So not every tribe participated in powwows traditionally, but today Indigenous peoples from across the country come together at powwows as a unique pan-Indigenous gathering and share in particular dances, songs, and so on and so forth. So some more terminology. I will use the term sovereignty. Tribes have limited sovereignty within the lands that they occupy. However, this level of sovereignty is comparable to that of states, as tribes have a direct relationship with the federal government, and states do not have the authority to enact laws within tribal nations' boundaries. I will give an example of that later on in the presentation. Self-determination is another term that's used. It's authority granted to sovereign nations, and it allows tribes to enact and enforce their own laws, govern themselves through tribal governments as they see fit, provide education and healthcare in line with culturally relevant practices. A big part of this is understanding that the healthcare system within Indigenous communities hasn't always been a positive. And so at times tribes have decided to, through compacts with the federal government, to implement our own healthcare systems through IHS. I will use the term colonization, and this is from the Oxford Dictionary. It's the action or process of settling among and establishing control over indigenous people of an area. And then I'll also use the term decolonization, which is the active resistance against colonial powers and shifting of power towards political, economic, educational, cultural, psychic independence and power that originate from a colonized nation's own indigenous peoples. So a lot of times today, indigenous communities are going through the process of decolonization after we've kind of faced the consequences of colonization. We'll talk a little bit, it may come up anyway, about historical trauma. And so I wanted to define this because this really relates to the race and equity that we're going through with these presentations in this series. So historical trauma is multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. It is related to major events that oppress a particular group of people because of their status as oppressed, such as slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. And I actually pulled this right from the ACF website, which is really cool that they acknowledge historical trauma as an experience here. I may use the term traditional. When I talk about traditional, I will be referring to traditional practices of indigenous people that predate contact, as well as those traditions that have continued uninterrupted by colonization. I didn't put a note here for oral histories, but I may talk a little bit about oral histories and our traditional stories of place. It is important when working with indigenous communities to acknowledge that intergenerational transmission of knowledge occurs most often within the home through oral histories. So the retelling of stories is incredibly important to indigenous communities. And finally, I may use the term traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which refers to the evolving knowledge acquired by indigenous and local peoples over hundreds of thousands of years through direct contact with the environment. So this is an understanding of place that comes from the experiences of people within place. I know one of the big topics with TEK today is, for example, the implementation of cultural burning or traditional land uses and management by indigenous peoples. I do just want to note again that although I did include these terms early in the presentation, I may not go into depth in each of them, but they're important buzzwords or keywords when talking about indigenous communities today.
And Herman, I think we may have a question for you. Sandra, I see that your hand is raised. Do you have a question?
No.
Thank you.
So the first thing I want to really do is center this conversation around indigenous peoples before I focus in on Washoe specifically. So although there's many tribes across the United States, we often get grouped in together as one. The reality is that each tribe is unique and distinct from one another. Many tribes may come from a particular region and share customs that are different from other regions. Many tribes may share the same language, but live in different regions and have different customs. One of the biggest things to remember with indigenous people is that our languages and cultures are often place-based, and at times when we talk about them, we acknowledge that our language and cultures come from the land itself. So although, and just kind of an example, although you'll see here the Great Basin as a region, some of the tribes within the Great Basin are different linguistically, but may share cultural norms, whereas some tribes within the Great Basin in, say, California, may share the same language, but be distinct culturally as far as their traditions and activities that they participate in due to those geographical differences. So in the United States today, there's 574 federally recognized tribal nations. Pre-colonization, there were roughly 300 distinct languages spoken in North America. And of that today, we have roughly 187 that are still alive. When we say alive, we mean spoken in the community or have elder speakers who learn the language as their first language. However, there are less than 40 of those languages that are still being taught in the home. And the reason that we list that as far as the languages being taught in the home That means that those languages are healthy and being passed on to future generations innately. Most of our languages today are either taught in classes, in some of those tribally owned schools, but very rarely do we see languages healthy and alive within the home and the community. So now to focus in on Wa-siw, or the Washoe people. So I want to open up with a brief retelling of the Washoe creation story, as the history of Washoe people started long before the arrival of settlers in this area. This story is only one version as told by my elders, but there are slight variations from storyteller to storyteller that are important to acknowledge. So a long time ago, Nintashu, or old woman, created Washoe, the Wa-siw, the Washoe people, from tule seeds. She divided the seeds into the Washoe, Batlel, Delbimush, and Danu. Batlel is Paiute in our language, Delbimush is Maidu, and Danu is Miwa. And she put these seeds into a woven jug. She asked Gewet, coyote in English, to deliver them. Before he left, she warned him not to open the jug no matter what. As he was going along, the jug began to make noise as the people were growing inside. They began to argue and fight, and Gewet, being the curious character that he is, decided that he would only take a quick peek. But as soon as he opened the jug, some of the people flew out and began to grow. Gewet traveled a little further before the noise began again, and once more, Gewet let his curiosity get the best of him and opened the jug. When he finally arrived to Wa-siw at Deh, what we call today the Washoe people's homeland, there were only a few seeds left. Gewet poured out the remaining seeds and they began to grow. Nintashu then called in a storm and told it to soak the land and to drench the land so that everything here could begin to grow. She turned to the plants and animals and told them to grow and provide for the people. And then she turned to the people and told them to care for all of these things that were now growing. This is how the Washoe people came to be, and from time immemorial, the Washoe people have always been told to care for this place as their home. One other thing in our creation story that I didn't note, but is important to acknowledge, is that in this same instance, Washoe people were a very small tribe. We have always been a very small tribe, but we're told in our creation story that we are proud of who we are, of our language and culture, and that in that kind of small numbers, that there's strength as well. So this next slide is Wa-siw at Deh. This is a map of our homelands. The homelands of the Washoe people once extended from Susanville in the north to Mono Lake down south. And we extended into the Great Basin to the east, and then over into the foothills of the Sacramento Valley to the west. Today, the Washoe tribe consists of 4 reservations, or Indian colonies as they are known. And we also have allotment lands, or trust lands. So our reservations, or Indian colonies, can be found in Carson, Stewart, here in the Carson Valley, in Dresserville, and then right on the alpine side of the border of California in the Woodbridge community. Each of these reservations are the places that I mentioned before where I talk about tribal sovereignty. These are the places where our laws come into play. We aren't able to create laws that extend beyond our borders, and it does get difficult as well because we aren't able to enforce a lot of our laws on non-Indigenous people or non-natives. In this map, you can see this yellow line here, the dotted yellow line. That's the actual territory that was determined to be solely Washoe as part of the Indian Claims Commission, or Docket 288. And then you can see that in the darker green, this is known as the main territory for Washoe people, or the primary subsistence settlement area. So this is where Washoe people were, and was really the center of our homeland. You can see in the lighter green that this is what they call the peripheral or secondary resource area. So this means that Washoe people access these places or were within these places throughout history. And a lot of our archaeological records reflect that. You can then see some of the trade routes too that go into the California side for acorn, fish, and then also our pine nut allotments, which are here in the Pine Nut Mountains, kind of on the southwest side of the map. So right along the California, or from the California border and along the Great Basin side. A lot of our traditional stories, so like even our creation story, for example, takes place prior to this being what it is today. So when we talk about, for example, the Lahontan Lake that used to take up a big part of the Great Basin, some of our elders say that our creation story actually took place way farther west in that inland sea. One of the other things that I just wanted to note on this is that during the Indian Claims Commission in docket 288, our territory was actually diminished to that small boundary that's shown in the yellow lines. The biggest reason for this is that when other tribes were entering into their own claims, land claims, any resource area that was determined to be a conflict between two tribes, neither tribe was awarded for that area. So they actually evaluated our land, and I will talk about this a little bit later, but they valued our land for the various resources, timber, mining, fishing, so on and so forth. And if two tribes had a conflict about a specific area, neither of those tribes were awarded that place. And so we, being a very small tribe, ended up in a tough situation where the Paiute people in the Great Basin came together as one nation, even though they're distinct tribes today, and paid claim to a large portion of land. And when we finally had our case heard, a lot of that land was already awarded outside of our community to a different tribe. So really, even though Indian reorganization and the Indian Claims Commission's kind of mission was to rightfully pay tribes for their land, it still caused further conflicts between other tribes and indigenous peoples. I also wanted to mention the idea of trust land, because I have that in here as well. Trust land is lands that are held by the federal government on behalf of indigenous peoples or tribal nations. So we don't actually own that land. That land is held by the federal government on our behalf. So it isn't land that the tribe can sell. Sometimes we can develop it if it's within our own missions and policies to do so, but that land isn't actually under the ownership of the tribe, even though we oversee and steward that land. So I wanted to touch again a brief history of the Wa-siw people and first contact. So 1925, roughly 200 years ago, the first explorers entered Washoe or Washoe country, and this is documented by Jedediah Smith. And then it wasn't until 1844 that first recorded contact with Washoe people specifically, and this was done by Captain John C. Fremont in the winter of 1844 when he came to Alpine County, California. There is a brief mention here of snowshoes, and this is a kind of cool part, is that we have unique snowshoes and cultural ties to place. And so John C. Fremont documented Washoe people as skittering across the top of the snow like birds, while he and the rest of his crew trudged through the snow trying to make it to California. In 1850, California Government and Protection Act, which established the means whereby Indians of all ages could be indentured or apprenticed to whites. 11 years later, an editorial in the Humboldt Times noted that this law works beautifully. A few days ago, B.E. Geiger, formerly an Indian agent, had some 80 Indians apprenticed to him and proposed to immigrate to Washoe with them as soon as he can cross the mountains. We hear of many others who are having them bound in numbers to suit. What a pity the provisions of this law are not extended to the greasers, Canics, and Asiatics. It would be so convenient, you know, to carry on a farm or mine when all the hard and dirty work is performed by the apprentices. So you can see here that as early as 1950, indigenous peoples in the area were subjugated through actual law in the United States and California as indentured servants for white settlers. And so from the get-go, we were treated as second-class citizens. This quickly moved to eradication from indentured servitude. So in 1950, the price of an Indian scalp in California was 25 cents a scalp. Oftentimes, settlers would go out and kill women and children and bring those scalps in for a bounty. So it wasn't just men that were targeted, but oftentimes even our youngest infants, as there was a bounty on the heads of indigenous people. During 1851, the United States paid out roughly $1 million for scalps. And in 1851, Peter Burnett, California's governor at the time, stated that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. This must be expected. While we cannot anticipate the result with but painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. So you can even see here from the California governor at the time that they treated indigenous peoples as a problem needing eradication in order to be solved. There was no conversations at this time of how to work together between indigenous peoples and the federal government or California state government. It was specifically get rid of the Indian problem. In 1854, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in California, T.J. Henley, proposed to the federal government that all California Indians be hauled off to the reservation east of the Sierra Nevada mountains in order to rid the state of this class of population. So even here again, the idea was to get rid of the problem. And as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes our language and cultures are tied to a specific place. So by moving all of the California tribes to Nevada into the Great Basin, it was also an attempt to destroy their connection to place and ability to carry on their language and traditions, even though the general eradication as far as actually killing of Native American people was the goal. So I've titled this one Changes to a Washoe Way of Life, because during the same time period, and we're looking at, a little over 10 years, Washoe people were no longer allowed or no longer able to go out and gather as they once did. In 1857, and this is called the Potato War, when really it wasn't a war by any means, occurred in Milford, California. Supposedly, Washoe people harvested potatoes from a farm, and in retaliation, a local militia killed a bunch of Washoe people on several occasions. Our recollection of this story is slightly different through our oral histories, but in general, Washoe people went back to an area that they had always gone to collect wild potatoes and other bulbs and root plants that we use for subsistence. When going to this now private land that was owned by a rancher or farmer, and gathering wild potatoes, or probably more so modern potatoes, off of the land like we had always done. We then became criminals within our own homeland and were tracked down and killed. Some of the actual historical records that I've seen on this talk about a local militia following footprints down to an area and killing women and children along with the men that were there. This is by no means a war and really just an act of genocide. In 1858, the Carson Valley Agency was established with Frederick Dodge as the first Indian agent in the area. In 1859, silver was discovered in western Nevada, and roughly 20,000 miners arrived seeking riches. This began the immediate destruction of the lands to support the mining industry and was the beginning of the end of a way of life for the Washoe people. Within a year, by 1859, the Indian agent Frederick Dodge proposed to move the Washoe to the Pyramid Lake and Walker River reservations. What he had proposed was to create one reservation in the Great Basin and move all indigenous peoples or all of the tribes in the area to that reservation. One of the biggest issues with this as it relates to Washoe people is that Paiutes were sort of our, I don't want to say mortal enemy, but one of our biggest rivals. And so there were often conflicts historically between our two tribes. And by putting us together on one reservation, there was going to be no peaceful resolution for either side. Later in 1859, commercial fishing at Lake Tahoe started, and by 1880, 20 years later, they had depleted the cutthroat trout population from Lake Tahoe. By 1860, Washoe people were blamed for the killing of 2 white men in Carson City because Washoe arrows were stuck in the bodies of the deceased. The Washoe men, or 3 Washoe men, were sacrificed for the crime, but escaped and were shot and killed while running away. 2 white men had later come forward and admitted to the murders, but the damage was already done and Washoe people paid the consequences. So this can be found here in local Genoa records. The locals in the area, the settlers, upon finding these 2 bodies and the arrows there, supposedly took the arrows to Paiute people, and the Paiute people said, no, those are Washoe arrows, those are not Paiute. They then came to Captain Jim at the time, who was one of our revered and respected leaders, and told him that if he didn't find the culprits of this, then they were going to kill all Washoe people in the area. Captain Jim was able to bring forward a couple of men. I think one was an older man and then a couple of younger boys. And they were the ones that were going to be sort of sacrificed for this killing, in which Washoe people were not the culprits. And as I mentioned, 2 white men later came forward and admitted to the murders, but by that time, Washoe people had already been targeted, and we had already felt losses within our community because of the wrongdoing of settlers. In 1860, the Pyramid Lake War started. Washoe people actually donated our guns to the state militia because the Washoes thought that the enemy of our enemy is our ally. So in this instance, the Paiute people are the main ally, and the settlers are the main enemy, and the settlers in the area would be our ally. Those guns were never returned to the Washoe people. In 1860, soldiers attacked and killed Washoe women near Slide Mountain in Washoe Valley, Nevada. By 1861, the Washoe people had requested a treaty with the US government, as within the 17-year period, we had already seen such destruction to our homelands and our people, that we were requesting a treaty for protection and to be able to establish roots within our own homelands again. In 1862, the US Department of the Interior introduced the name for Tahoe, which actually comes from the Washoe word da'au. So kind of funny side story, whenever we say Lake Tahoe or Lake Da'au, we're actually saying lake in the Washoe language. The name for Da'au'aga, or for Lake Tahoe, didn't become official until 1945. And Mark Twain, one of our great American authors, actually despised this name because it was a Washoe word. So I'm going to kind of highlight some of Mark Twain's rhetoric on this topic. And by the way, I do note that Mark Twain was by no means my favorite writer. And even within my tenure here with the Washoe tribe as an employee, I worked with Darrell Cruz, our TIPO officer, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, to stop the naming of a cove in North Shore, Tahoe. The proposed name was Samuel Clemens, which is Mark Twain's real name. And so the tribe vehemently opposed that because of the writings of Mark Twain. So in 1863, the San Francisco newspaper, Golden Era, reprinted a column from the Territorial Enterprise from Virginia City attributed to Mark Twain, in which he discusses with a friend named Grubb concerning the name Lake Tahoe. He says, "I hope some early bird will catch this grub the next time he calls Lake Bigler by so disgustingly sick and silly name as Lake Tahoe. I have removed the offensive words from this letter, which at least has a Christian English twang about it. Of course, Indian names are more fitting than any other for our beautiful lakes and rivers, which knew their race long ago. But let us have none as repulsive to the ears as Tahoe, for the beautiful relic of a fairyland forgotten and left asleep in the snowy Sierras when the little elves fled from their ancient haunts and quieted the earth. I yearn for the scalp of the soft-shelled crab, be he Indian or white man, who conceived of that spoony, slobbering summer complaint of a name. Why, if I had a grudge against the half-price black man, I wouldn't be mean enough to call him by such an epithet as that, Tahoe. It sounds as weak as a soup for a sick infant." He later goes on, and this again was republished in 1869, to talk about the sorrow and misfortune overtake this legislature that still from year to year permits Tahoe to retain its unmusical cognomen, Tahoe. Tahoe means grasshoppers, it means grasshopper soup. It is Indian and suggestive of Indians. They say it is Paiute, possibly it is Digger, those degraded savages who roast their dead relatives, then mix the human grease and ashes of bones with tar and vomit thick all over their heads and foreheads and ears and go caterwauling about the hills and call it morning. These are the gentry that named the lake. So one of the big things that I wanted to highlight here is that through propaganda, and oftentimes even in this sort of cynicism of writers, Indigenous peoples were always treated as lesser. And especially within our own homelands, there was often derogatory terms used to describe us and our language, even though we were, again, the original stewards of this place. So a little bit later, Nevada Territory, the state of Washoe. In 1863, on November 2nd of 1863, the elected delegates of Nevada Territory, met in Carson City to frame a constitution for the state of Washoe. A number of the delegates objected the name, among them an L.O. Stearns from Esmeralda County, who offered the following remarks. We are here, sir, to brush away the relics of Washoe barbarism and Paiute ignorance and atrocity. We oppose the name Washoe because it represents the lowest and most despicable tribe of Indians that ever desecrated the American continent. Washoe, wash what? This despicable tribe, a disgrace to the name of Indians, possessing all of his baser instincts and none of his manly attributes. Let his name go down unsung and unpainted upon the escutcheon of on the Gem of the Pacific. So even here, we can see that our state legislatures talk derogatorily about Indigenous peoples. And again, the hope was to erase our existence altogether and in no way acknowledge our presence within our own homelands. Within a 20-year span, the Wa-siw, our ancestral homelands, had changed so much that we were no longer able to freely roam our territories, gather and collect traditional fish, medicines, plants, hunt, and so on and so forth. And so by 1964, the Indian agent, and we had a new Indian agent, Jacob Lockhart, recommended 360 acres in the Carson Valley and 360 acres in Washoe Valley to be set aside as reservation lands for Washoe people. This again came up in 1865, 1871, and 1877. And the Indian Agency recommended Washoe reservations, but no action was taken. By 1866, H.G. Parker, superintendent of the Nevada Indian Affairs agent, stated, there is no suitable place for a reservation in the bounds of their territory, and in the view of the rapidly diminishing numbers and the disease to which they are subjected, none is required. So 22 years later, after John C. Fremont first acknowledged that Washoe people were here as a distinct tribe, we had already seen that the state of Washoe people and the health of Washoe people had diminished so much that those in charge of kind of advocating on our behalf had saw that we were more likely to be eradicated than maintained, either through policy, disease, slavery, starvation, so on and so forth. But the hope was that we would no longer be here. And this is roughly 22-year time period. We're not even talking about the 200 years of contact in which we've survived. So I titled this one Destruction to Washoe Lands, and although that was something that was ongoing, this kind of time period was something that further displays this destruction. So in 1877, the Carson Valley News highlighted an article titled "Fish Dying." Indians report great mortality among the fish in the Carson River. They say, "No more catch 'em, keep sick, keep die." Whether it is the low state of the water or the use of poisonous or explosive materials that causes the destruction, no one pretends to know. We understand that it is confined exclusively to the West Fork, nothing of the kind being perceptible on the East Fork. Fish above the rear of the wood drive are plentiful and healthy as ever. So this reflects that by 1877, the logging industry and pollution happening in the Carson River was so destructive that there were no longer any fish available. You can also see in here that in the newspaper, they use this language, "No more catch 'em, keep sick, keep die." It's kind of a derogatory way that Indigenous peoples spoke the English language. And of course, this is what we see in, for example, the Peter Pan movie, when the scenes go to the Native people there as well. Later that year, September 13th, 1877, Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City stated the Indians are preparing to go out into the mountains in search of pine nuts. The Pine Nut Valley is the nearest point where they can hope to gather. So Washoe people were still following their seasonal traditions in the fall to go and gather pine nuts. However, the clear cutting of the pine nut allotment, so the pine nut hills by the Virginia City mines, made it super difficult to find pine nuts and destroyed critical habitat for this endemic species to the area. So again, not only were Indigenous people directly impacted by the changes to this area, but we also see the loss of pine nuts or pinyon pines. And we also see the die-off of multiple fish in the area. By 1880, this should be 1888, April 11th, 1888, Captain Jim and Captain Pete, along with Captain Walker, met and prepared a petition to the Governor Kincaid of Nevada, requesting that he stop the destruction of pine trees and also the depletion of fish in Lake Tahoe. It stated, "We demand that the government stop further destruction of the property belonging to the Washoe people, or in default thereof, that the government of the United States make us a suitable compensation for the same." One of the things I wanted to highlight here in this slide is that during this time period, Washoe people were starting to move into areas where they could homestead. So one of the big places was our allotment lands, was our pine nut hills or our mosh. In the Washoe language, we say "di mosh" for my face and "di mosh" for my pine nut lands. So in our oral histories or our traditions, we talk about treating of the pine nut lands the same way we would treat our own faces or ourselves. So they were incredibly important and valuable, not just for the resources that they provided, but as an extension of Washoe people's cultures. In 1880, a new law forbade Washoe fishing because the commercial fishing at Lake Tahoe depleted the Lahontan cutthroat trout. Again, the Washoe people paid the cost for someone else's crimes. 1881, Indians at Lake Bigler are destroying many fish with spears. As the law does not appear to affect them, it would be a good thing to arrest the whites who purchased the speared fish. If the Indians cannot dispose of the fish in that way, they will soon discontinue the practice. One of the big things that's highlighted by this passage is that Washoe people were looking for ways to survive within our own homelands, and being able to go out and hunt and fish and then sell those in commercial markets was a way of surviving, since we were no longer able to survive as we once did. This also brings up the point of some of our cultural adaptations that occurred. Around this same time period, Washoe women began selling their baskets to those who traveled through the area or were settlers here. I think many people have heard of Datsaloli, a Washoe basket weaver around this time period. And many of the Washoe women who were making baskets were credited with the development of the Digikup, or the fancy basket as it's known today. These baskets were highly sought after and prized. Today, many of them sell for millions of dollars within private collections. And one of the cool things to highlight here with Washoe weavers and baskets is that they developed this art form as a means of subsistence by using something that was already a significant part of their culture. By 1890, December 17th, the Stewart Indian School opened in the south end of Carson City, named after Nevada's first senator, William Stewart. Washoe children were forced to live at the school, which was under the authority of the War Department at the time. So it's important to note that before the creation of the Department of the Interior and before the BIA and all of these other agencies that tribes have to deal with today, we were under the oversight of the War Department, which treated us as an enemy. And many of the reasons why these policies that sought eradication of indigenous peoples were in place. So later in 1891, about 150 Washoe people assembled near Washoe, which is still known as that today at Tahoe, and were addressed by Captain Jim, the highest authority of the tribe. The meeting was the outgrowth of the conviction of the Indian for spearing a fish. He stated that they were the only tribe left without a reservation, and that the old Indians who were unable to work for a living thought it was pretty hard to be prohibited from spearing a fish to live on. The speaker held that the government should provide a reservation for Washoe people. By 1893, the Washoe Pinot allotment lands in Nevada, totaling about 64,000 acres, and then the Sacramento allotments on the California side, which was roughly 2,600 acres, was established and completed in 1910. Any water sources within the Pinot allotments was set aside for state selection for the purposes of non-Indian uses. So Christina actually brought up a good point with this, is that when lands were divvied up as allotment lands, there was a couple of different acts. So there's the Homestead Act, and then there's also what's called the Dawes General Allotment Act. And both of these divvied up allotment lands for head of households for indigenous families. So this was implemented across the United States, but was different from region to region. For example, in the Great Plains, when the Dawes Act was implemented, it checkerboarded allotment lands. And the idea was that an indigenous family would own property and be surrounded by white farmers or ranchers on all sides, in the hopes that they would readily adapt to ranching or farming by having that example around them. What often happened, and why there was the need for creation of reservations, is that indigenous people who lived communally amongst their tribe were now forced to live as individual families on these allotments. And many times those families sold their allotment for pennies on the dollar to the local ranchers in order to return to a communal setting within their tribe. So a big reason for our reservations today is that indigenous people have chosen to live communally, to live in a shared space and area. And those attempts to kind of get us to be individuals in the likeness of American society were complete failures and actually caused more loss of land for indigenous peoples. I also highlighted in here that when the lands were divvied up, or allotment lands in the Pinot Hills, that all the water rights or lands that had any water rights to them were saved for state selection, which means distribution to non-Indians or non-Washoe people. So even though the goal here was, again, to get us to homestead in an area, to have lands of our own, there was no ability to live in these places because there was no water, access to water in these areas. And that was intentful to make sure that we didn't have good quality land for farming, grazing, and so on and so forth. By 1899, the Carson Indian Agency presented deeds to 528 Washoe people for roughly 62,713 acres of allotment land. By 1912, the Nevada governor and lieutenant governor petitioned the congressional delegate for legislation to secure lands for Washoe people. In 1913, Captain Pete and Captain Pete Mayo made another petition asking for better lands for homestead and water. There's a passage from Joanne Nevers' book, Wa-siw, where she notes that Washoe people had made a request for lands at Lake Tahoe. And we were told that we would either take what we're given or we would get nothing. And so those early attempts to secure lands in the Tahoe Basin, a place that's incredibly important and sacred to Washoe people, were outright denied and even received with threats of taking no land at all. In 1914, Captain Pete Mayo and Sarah Mayo took a special gift basket to President Woodrow Wilson with a petition and grievances for the protection of Washoe territory. It was received with a thank you, but there was no action for better conditions from the president. In 1916, an Indian appropriations bill authorizes the purchase of lands explicitly for Washoe Indians and other landless Indians in Nevada. April 5th, 1917, Douglas County, Nevada passed an ordinance that ordered all Indians out of Gardnerville and Minden by 6:30 p.m. every day, or to go to jail for 10 days or pay a fine of $25 or both. I note here that this wasn't repealed until 1974, so we're talking roughly 10 years after the Civil Rights Movement, which created equality amongst people. So this was still on the books in Douglas County 10 years past that. This act or this piece of legislation is something that our communities still feel today. Many of our elders living in that time period where this law was used to keep them out of town, but more so enforced in a derogatory manner. We actually had a meeting at the Dresserville Community Council back in July, and one of our elders told the story of him, being in town past the curfew, and I think he was 12 or 13 at the time, but he and the other young men from the community that he was with were jailed here in the Carson Valley, and they actually weren't released until their heads were shaved. So that's also reflective of the scalping of Indigenous peoples that occurred prior to this. And when he told this story, I think he stated that it was around the 1950s. In 1917, 157 acres of the Carson Colony were established, 40 acres for the Dresserville Colony, and then an additional 20 acres in what's today Reno Sparks Indian Colony. And these were established through an act of Congress. Later on, there was the Woodford's community, which I mentioned, and then the Stewart community were also created. The Stewart community is an extension of the Stewart boarding school, and so a lot of those lands and ranch lands that were tied to the boarding school were returned to the tribe, but that wasn't until roughly the 1970s. In 1918, Douglas County, Nevada issued work permits that demanded all Washoe men work in the fields or face prosecution. So here again, we're seeing that Washoe people within our own homelands are required to participate in indentured servitude.
And then Herman, I just want to let you know that some people may have to leave at noon. That's our meeting.
That's completely fine. I do have a couple more slides to finish up, and then I know you wanted to talk about a few different things, and so I made notes of ways that we can get involved in Indigenous issues, but if anybody has to go, I completely understand. So by 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was enacted. In 1935, the Washoe tribe established our first tribal council. 1936, we developed a constitution and bylaws of the Washoe tribe, and this was approved by the Department of the Interior. 1937, the Washoe tribe was given a corporate charter and designated as a federally recognized tribe. So here we are roughly 100 years after first contact, when we're finally established as a federal tribe, able to, again, enact our own laws, given the extension of self-determination and sovereignty. In 1951, Washoe filed a petition with the Indian Claims Commission, known as Docket 288. This is what I talked about with our homelands map. In October 31st, 1969, almost 20 years later, after we first petitioned the Indian Claims Commission, Washoe people were awarded their claim against the United States for the illegal taking of Washoe lands. The settlement was drastically reduced from the original amount to roughly $5 million, with 70% of this being distributed per capita, 20% going to investments for the tribe, and then another 10% going to property investment, so purchasing of land. One thing I wanted to note here is that while we were awarded $5,000, some of the evaluations of our traditional lands were upwards of 80 million. So to get 5 million out of a potential 80 million, especially when accounting for timber, mining, fish, water rights, and so on and so forth, is a little bit of a slap in the face, because again, settlers continued to use those and benefit from them when they were once Washoe peoples. In 1951, Chief Hank Pete, now 69 years of age, says his one desire is to have a small piece of land at Lake Tahoe. It is today that Indians have no rights to make campfire around the lake. We can't even look for herbs, for medicines. We can't go for wild berries. Property owners do not permit us. Some place for Washoe campgrounds could be found where Washoes could come at least during the summer months. So again, Washoe people have always held a strong connection to the Tahoe Basin. So the last thing I wanted to highlight here was some of the changes that have occurred in the recent past. I highlighted here in 1978, the Washoe Hunting and Fishing Commission was established. This is key because in 1980, we won a court case to regulate our own hunting and fishing on our allotment lands. This was actually against the state of Nevada, and again, noting tribal sovereignty, Nevada does not have the authority over Indian lands to establish any regulatory form of hunting and fishing, and so those are all within our jurisdiction. In 2002, rock climbing was banned at Cave Rock by the U.S. Forest Service, and then permanently banned in 2004. This is another instance where Washoe people won a federal court case. It was actually the U.S. Forest Service and the Washoe tribe versus recreational climbers. And this is one of the few times where indigenous people's spiritual beliefs or connection to place was upheld over that of recreational activities. So all climbing was banned from Cave Rock or Wa-siw as we know it. And again, this was because that is an incredibly sacred and important place to Washoe people and our spiritual center. In 2009, Skunk Harbor at Lake Tahoe was conveyed to the tribe, totaling 23 acres with lake access. The tribe renamed it in 2010 Daudish Dugamum, which means trees looking into the water, for the parcel. And then Utsiliwata, or Chickmunk Stream, was the name for the stream that enters in that area. So here we are again, roughly 50 years after Hank Pete had first talked about having land in the Tahoe Basin, that we were finally awarded any sort of land of our own. We do also manage the Meeks Bay Resort on the west shore, but that's still a Forest Service property and not the tribe's completely. A couple of other things that I wanted to highlight here was that in 2016, Itgumum Tewewe Ushashis, or Dance Hill here in the Carson Valley, was listed on the National Register of Historical Places as a traditional cultural property. And then in 2017, Wa-siw, or Cave Rock, was also listed as the National Register of Historical Places as a traditional cultural property in Lake Tahoe. There was a historical marker placed at the Cave Rock State Park commemorating Wa-siw. So I wanted to make a quick note, and I titled this slide Traditions Today, and it is because although we're often talked about in the historical past as Indigenous people, Washoe people are still alive and well today. So although the history of Washoe people since contact has not been pretty, the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California continues to persevere and maintain many traditions as living and alive within the tribe. As our creation story outlines, our land will take care of us, and in return, we will always take care of our lands. So although our language is at a critical state and not all of our community members may be able to practice their traditions openly, we do have quite a few who maintain their traditions as weavers, hunters, gatherers, taking care of our traditional medicines and stewarding our lands, not only as a federally recognized tribe, but also as individuals in our communities who care about those things so deeply. So I just want to note that while we always talk about indigenous peoples with this perspective of the past and historically stagnant, we are very much alive today. We do have quite a bit to offer to the surrounding world, and we do still have issues that we face regularly. So Dinga Ledi, that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Herman. So just very quickly, I want to recognize it is noon. If people have to hop off, we'll see you soon. And Herman, I just really want to, as a collaborative, we really recognize and honor your story and the story of the Washoe people and the history of the Washoe people. And I really appreciate you going through the history in chronological order. And I think it really helps us understand as a collaborative, like the history of policies that have been implemented against the Washoe people that are really rooted in systemic and institutional oppression and racism. And so it's a hard story to hear, and I appreciate your willingness to spend the time with us and really, again, helping us increase our overall knowledge and really helping paint a really, really clear picture for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I also want to extend my gratitude for inviting us to the table to help participate in this discussion. One of the things that I think I noted early on when talking with Christina was that oftentimes the history of Indigenous peoples is told as the whole. So even in our US history curriculum, we focus on the Great Plains and the Lakota or Sioux people who were actually at war with the federal government. And very rarely do we give these smaller tribes such as Washoe the opportunity to share how these same policies were derogatory in nature towards us and how even different policies set us up for failure as well. So thank you guys for having these tough conversations. I really just want to say thank you so much for inviting us, for talking about critical race theory, for going through this really, really hard work.
And so I would say in closing, I ideally, would love to have more time to do some reflection and ask questions, but if everyone could just kind of share in the chat box, just kind of take a moment and share any like takeaways or any impressions that you're walking away with from our time together. And then like Herman, do you have a few minutes for a couple of questions, or do you need to hop off as well?
Oh no, I'm happy to stay.
Okay, so thank you for your generosity. So yes, please put in your chat box your takeaways, any impressions, and then if anyone has any questions, you could just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask those questions. That would be really helpful. And Valentina, I will open that up to everybody in the Spanish room as well, and then we're gonna have to figure out the interpretation. Okay, thank you. So any questions for Herman?
Thank you, Herman. This is River. And I loved your presentation, although it's obviously really hard to hear and felt a lot of grief. But so what, in your view or your opinions, what are the things that we can do? How can we take this pain and kind of channel it to something good, right? Is there steps we can take? Thank you.
You ask a really good question. It's a very tough one. So for example, in my department, I work on culture and language revitalization, and it's something that I oftentimes feel like has to happen within community organically. So we have to be able to revitalize our language and value our cultural practices as a tribe and as a people in order to be able to teach those things outwardly. And so oftentimes that's very individual and personal work that we have to do. However, just in the national kind of schema of things, there's so many different ways to support Indigenous peoples. I did send an email to Christina, so if anybody's interested, I can share these a little bit more. But some of the things that are happening right now, for example, is the Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day. So no longer recognizing these kind of figures in history that have been celebrated incorrectly for so long, and starting to move towards recognizing the harsh reality of colonization and its impacts on Indigenous people, removing and renaming racist mascots, place names, and caricatures. So Nevada recently passed a bill that will remove all Native mascots, caricatures, and racist place names. So for example, we see right near the Truckee area with the renaming of Squaw Valley, resort to the Palisades. A really big win for us because that word squaw is completely derogatory towards both Indigenous peoples, but specifically Indigenous women. One of the other things that's happening right now nationwide is this review of the Indian boarding schools and identifying kind of the mass graves and lost children who went to these schools but never returned home. And so in this instance, again, it's something that we have the stories in our communities to say, you know, so-and-so went to a boarding school and never came back, and there's no record of their existence beyond that. But finally, the federal government's taking the initiative to actually acknowledge that and do the research to support it. On some of these ends, as far as acknowledging the wrong history, what my biggest takeaway is that I'm looking forward to the reconciliation that happens afterwards. So with the boarding schools, for example, it was an instrument to destroy our language and culture. Henry Richard Pratt, who founded Carlisle Institute, his actual founding phrase was "kill the Indian, save the man." So get rid of all of our cultural norms or our languages in order to kind of create an empty shell that they could fill up with information and have these people be second-class citizens to do work within settlers' homes and so on and so forth. There's also, for example, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, an ongoing issue, but was recently highlighted again with the missing woman in Montana. The attention that's given to a missing white woman versus that's given to Indigenous people or people of colors in general who are also facing the same issues. One thing that I think that we can all come together on and that really supports Indigenous peoples as well is this fight for climate change. So this isn't, again, a specific Indigenous issue, but when we see our lands change so drastically with drought and fires and climate change in general and the heat that comes with that, we can no longer go out and practice our traditions. So for example, my son Del Palelik is 6 months old, and we just went out last weekend to our pine nut allotment lands to go and see if there's any dogum that were ready to be gathered. And so at least this year, there were absolutely no pine nuts that we could find, no cones or anything like that. And so here I am hoping to raise my son in our language and culture to the best of my abilities. But in his first year of life, he won't be able to have pine nut soup or to go and participate in those kind of things that I grew up doing and so many others my age and older remember. Kind of just on the other end too, there's a lot of things that Indigenous peoples need support in. So one of the biggest things is that when conversations are happening about different issues, to have an Indigenous voice or representative at the table is always important. And in the same instance, when we're developing policies and procedures for consultation and other things, I was lucky enough to attend a couple of Tahoe Trails meetings recently. And there's this kind of conversation about consulting tribes, but it's so important that being on the ground level, that we actually institute consultation with tribes as a requirement when developing policies and procedures. So that way it isn't something that organizations or institutions do on the back end, but something that's required from the very get-go. So just making sure that tribal governments are treated with that sort of respect and brought to the table is incredibly important. And there's numerous issues that are happening here locally. Thacker Pass, and I believe it's in northern Nevada right now, has a camp set up to stop mining. There's the salmon run that happens every year with the Wintun Nation in the California side, where they're fighting to remove dams to allow for salmon to again spawn in their endemic habitats. We had an issue here recently, probably about 5 years ago, where the sage grouse was going to be listed as an endangered species, which would have created quite a few protections for the land in which those sage grouse inhabitat. But in order to kind of keep that from receiving the designation, there was a lot of kind of political infighting to say that, oh, the sage grouse is happy, or we're doing all of these things to protect it already, why would it need further protections? But in that instance, what had occurred that affected the Washoe tribe was they actually clear-cut 60 acres of pine nut forest. Not only was that a slap in the face that we lost access to some of our pine nut lands and trees, but they actually clear-cut the wrong 60 acres because of a GPS error, and then went back and clear-cut another 60 acres for this sage grouse. So I think one of the biggest things is that when we talk about our natural environments and the places that we live, you know, we all today have to take some sort of ownership as stewards of these places and protect the things that are happening here. Speak up for Indigenous peoples when we're able to, but even more so, bring those Indigenous voices to the table.
Thank you,
Thank
Herman.
you.
Those are really, really clear examples. Thank you. Other questions for Herman?
I have a question. My name is Eric Mertens. I'm with the town of Truckee and work in our sustainability department. But in terms of bringing those voices to the table, I guess just if you can point us to the best contacts in terms of ensuring that we have those proactive conversations, I think that's such a great point as our planners are developing projects and whatnot, which is not something I have direct kind of control over, but definitely can provide feedback there, especially as we are working on the town's general plan right now.
So within the Washoe tribe, oftentimes the best way to go about it is to contact our tribal headquarters and our tribal administrator. It is tough because we do face a lot of turnover in our administration, so it's not always the same person that you will be contacting. But right now, Bernadette Nieto is an awesome tribal administrator. She's also a tribal member. And at the very least, she can get you in contact with either myself or Daryl Cruz or even the chairman for the Washoe tribe. There is this kind of distinction within our communities because, of course, we have our elected leaders like our chairman, who's the elected voice and representative of the tribe, but he's also incredibly busy. So it's not always easy to go right to the chairman, even though he's the lead of our organization. So just kind of working through those processes within the tribe. But at the same time, if you're not able to get a hold of somebody, feel free to reach out to me directly. And if I can help, I will. But if not, I'll put you in contact with the right people and make sure that the issues are brought forward. I did want to note that because I wasn't sure if everybody is here locally or if some people are zooming in from other places, but there is a really cool app. It's actually called Native Land, and it's by Victor Gerard Temprano. And so if you're ever in an area and you're not sure whose homeland you're in or which tribe to contact, it's a cool app to be able to use to look up and find information about local tribes based on your GPS location.
And Herman, could you repeat the name of the person?
Yeah, it is.
It?
It's called Native Land, and it's by Victor Gerard Temprano. So when you look Native Land and you find the app, that'll be the developer.
Okay.
And it's a really cool app because it's created by Indigenous peoples. They were super friendly, so I actually pulled up the app to see what it said and see how accurate it was. And of course, our language wasn't written as we would write it from our program. And so I reached out to them and they made those corrections right away. But a really cool app to see, and they're super respectful of Indigenous people and our Indigenous peoples themselves.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I'm downloading it right now. So other questions or comments for Herman? Okay. Well, Herman, again, thank you so much. And again, we are very grateful as a collaborative that you spent time with us this morning and went over your time. And thank you to our partners for staying on the call for this really important conversation. And again, we just really honor and appreciate the difficulty of sharing the stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to say to everyone who listened in, thank you all. You are all doing great work for being here today. And Baligi Gabagi, we'll see you in the future.
Thank you, Herman. And thank you, Christina. Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, Felicity, so much. I really appreciate it.